Marcus's body tensed, every instinct urging him to run. The cold hand lingered, sending an icy shiver down his spine. He spun around, but the figure was gone, vanished into the thickening fog that had crept in unnoticed. The graveyard had become unnervingly still, save for the pounding of his heart. His mind raced. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. But there was no answer. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were alive, watching him. He turned back to the gravestone. The names of his parents were still there, etched in stone, and the date of their deaths, 3 years later than he'd been told, stared back at him. His stomach churned. If this was true, then the fire that had taken his parents wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lie, a cover-up. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence. Marcus's flashlight flickered back to life for a split second, just long enough for him to spot something buried near the grave, an old, tattered journal. He knelt down to retrieve it, his hands trembling. The leather was cracked and worn, as if it had been buried for decades. Opening the journal, he found the first page covered in strange symbols. His eyes darted over the cryptic writing, struggling to make sense of it. Then, he saw something that made his blood run cold, his mother's name written on the last line. "They've marked you. Beware the ones who walk in shadows. The truth is buried with them." His fingers trembled as he turned the page. The next entry was even more disturbing. The fire was not an accident. The truth lies within the walls of the manor. They will stop at nothing to keep it hidden. I must leave tonight. If you are reading this, Marcus, do not trust anyone, not even me. A chill swept over him as he read those final words. His mother had known something she hadn't shared with him before her death, and now it seemed someone wanted him to know the truth. Marcus stood up quickly, feeling the weight of the journal in his hands. A noise echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he spun around to face the direction of the sound. He couldn't see anyone, but the shadows around him seemed to pulse with life, as if the very ground beneath him was breathing. Then a voice, a low, menacing whisper, drifted to him from the darkness. "You should never have come here, Marcus." The voice, distorted and filled with malice, sent a wave of panic crashing through Marcus. He tightened his grip on the journal and looked around, his eyes scanning the dark, fog-choked graveyard. But there was no one to be seen. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. "You should never have come here, Marcus." The voice came again, this time closer, as if it were whispering directly into his ear. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. He stumbled backward, tripping over a tombstone. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the cemetery gates, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The air felt thick, pressing against him, as if the night itself were trying to hold him in place. His mind raced, but there was only one thing he could focus on now: the manor. The journal had mentioned it, the manor where the truth was buried. His parents' deaths, the mysterious figures in the graveyard, the strange message, they were all leading him to that place. And he knew, deep down, that the answers he sought could only be found there. His mind flashed back to his childhood memories of the old manor, a grand, decaying house on the edge of town that had always been shrouded in rumors and fear. It had stood empty for years, abandoned by the townsfolk and left to rot in isolation. There were whispers that something unnatural lingered there, something tied to his family's past. Now it seemed that something was calling him. By the time Marcus reached the manor, the fog had thickened, blanketing the grounds in an eerie silence. The mansion loomed before him, its windows like dark eyes staring down at him. The once beautiful stone structure was now overgrown with ivy, its walls cracked and crumbling. It was a place of nightmares, a place he had long avoided. The front door creaked open with a slow groaning sound as if it had been waiting for him. He hesitated, his hands still gripping the journal tightly. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not now, not when the truth was so close. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The sudden darkness swallowed him whole, but before he could react, the flashlight in his hand flickered and died once again. A cold gust of wind blew through the hallway, and Marcus felt a cold breath on his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet seemed to groan in protest, as if the house itself were coming alive. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in on him, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. His pulse quickened, but he pressed on. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house were trying to keep him from uncovering its secrets. The journal burned in his hand, urging him forward, as if it were guiding him toward a specific room. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. The room beyond was cloaked in darkness, but Marcus could feel something, a presence, waiting for him on the other side. As he approached, the door creaked open further, revealing a faint light flickering within. With one last shaky breath, Marcus stepped into the room. The air was thick with dust and decay, but in the center of the room a small table sat, its surface covered in old, yellowed papers. Among them, a photo of his parents, their faces twisted in fear, lay face up. And beside the photo, an object that chilled Marcus to his core, an old, rusted key. Marcus's fingers trembled as he reached for the key. It was cold, far colder than any metal should be, and its edges were worn with age. He turned it over in his hand, but no markings, no clues revealed its purpose. The room, once silent, now felt thick with an oppressive energy that pressed against him, urging him to leave. But he couldn't. Not yet. The photograph of his parents seemed to mock him, their terrified expressions frozen in time. He could almost hear their voices calling to him, urging him to understand. Why had they looked so afraid? The question gnawed at him, digging deeper into his mind, but before he could think further, a sudden, sharp sound pierced the air, like a door slamming somewhere deep within the manor. Marcus jumped, his heart racing. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was here with him. The footsteps he had heard earlier, the whispers, they weren't just figments of his imagination. He wasn't sure what he feared more, the answers or the things that wanted to keep him from them. The key felt heavier now in his palm, as if it were trying to pull him in a specific direction. Almost against his will, his body moved toward the far corner of the room, where a large, dusty mirror hung crookedly on the wall. The reflection that stared back at him seemed wrong. The glass shimmered unnaturally, as if it were something other than just a mirror. In the dim light, he could make out something in the reflection, someone standing just behind him. His heart stopped. He spun around, but there was no one there. Only empty, decaying walls. The reflection, however, didn't change. The figure in the mirror remained, standing silently, its features obscured by the shadows. It was almost like it was waiting for him. Marcus stepped closer to the mirror, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the glass. The instant his fingers made contact, a strange force surged through him, sending a shock of cold through his entire body. The reflection of the room seemed to ripple, distorting as though it were no longer a mere reflection, but a portal. With a crack, the mirror's surface shattered, and someone, stepped out of it. The figure was tall and draped in black, its features hidden beneath a hood. A low, raspy voice echoed from the figure's hidden face, and it was the same voice Marcus had heard earlier in the graveyard. "You should not have come." Marcus took a step back, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. His breath came in ragged gasps as the figure slowly advanced, its presence suffocating and unnatural. The figure raised a hand, and the room seemed to darken further, as if the shadows were gathering around them. The temperature dropped even further, and Marcus could see his breath fogging in the air. The key is just the beginning, Marcus. The truth you seek is far more dangerous than you realize. It is not just your parents' deaths that you must uncover, but the dark legacy that binds your bloodline. Marcus's mind reeled. He had so many questions, but no answers. All he could do was stare at the figure, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. The key in his hand pulsed, as if alive, drawing him toward the figure and the darkness behind it. The figure took another step, and with that movement, the shadows behind it seemed to writhe. Then, the figure spoke one final time. "There is no escape now." The figure's words sent a jolt of terror through Marcus. No escape? What did that mean? Panic surged within him, and for a moment, he stood frozen, unable to move. His thoughts raced in a frenzy, but they all collided into a singular, terrifying idea. The figure knew him, knew his family's darkest secret, and now, It was waiting to pull him into something far worse than death itself. The figure reached out, its hand elongated and skeletal, its fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. Marcus's heart hammered violently against his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the manor, but his legs felt like they were trapped in cement. The shadows seemed to close in around him, suffocating him, wrapping him in a cold embrace. "What do you want from me?" Marcus stammered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure's hooded face remained unreadable, its eyes hidden beneath the darkness. But the air around Marcus grew heavier, oppressive, as if the figure's very presence was feeding on his fear. "Everything you hold dear," the figure whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The truth, Marcus, it is your destiny to uncover it. You can't escape what is already in your blood." With that, the figure stepped forward, and Marcus was pulled out of his dazed stupor by an overwhelming force. His body moved against his will, as if guided by some invisible hand. He stumbled forward, unable to resist, his mind screaming for him to break free, but his body refused to obey. The shadows gathered around him, their tendrils creeping along the floor and walls, dragging him deeper into the room. In the center of the room stood an archway, an ancient, arched doorway, covered in twisted roots and vines that pulsed with a sickly glow. It hadn't been there before. "No, no!" Marcus struggled, but the shadows tugged harder, pulling him toward the doorway. The key in his hand grew warm, almost hot, as if it were reacting to the archway, to the dark energy surrounding him. As he was pulled closer, he glimpsed something beyond the archway, a massive stone chamber, its walls etched with symbols that matched those in the journal. The air there was thick with dread, as if the very atmosphere were made of fear and sorrow. The figure's voice echoed from the shadows, cruel and low. "You're too late, Marcus. The gate has already opened. There is no turning back now." His body lurched forward, and before he could even scream, he was pulled through the archway. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world around him twisted. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vanish, replaced by a swirling abyss of shadows and light. He fell, plummeted, into the depths of the unknown, the key in his hand glowing brighter with each passing second. The journal had vanished, as had the photograph, leaving nothing but darkness surrounding him. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he landed, hard. He gasped for air, his body aching from the fall. As his vision adjusted, he realized he was no longer in the manor. He was in a cavernous underground space, an ancient, forgotten temple. The walls were lined with more symbols, the same ones from the journal, their eerie glow illuminating the room with an unsettling light. A figure stood before him, silhouetted against the far wall. As Marcus's eyes focused, he saw that it was a woman he recognized. It was his mother, but something was horribly wrong. Her face was twisted, her eyes empty, hollow. The woman who had once held him in her arms, who had been kind and loving, was now a pale, ghostly reflection of herself, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "Welcome, Marcus," she whispered, her voice echoing in the cavern. "You've come to learn the truth, but you may wish you never had." Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure of his mother. Her hollow eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now seemed like empty windows to something far darker, more sinister. Her smile, wide and unnerving, sent chills rippling through his entire body. "Mom?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "Is it really you?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, as if she were studying him. The air in the cavern grew colder, more suffocating with each passing second. "Not quite," she said, her voice a low, eerie murmur that echoed in the cavern. "I am what remains of her. The truth you seek has already taken her, and now it is claiming you." Her words sent a surge of panic through Marcus. Claiming me? What was she talking about? This couldn't be real. His mother had died years ago, in that fire. It had been a tragic accident, hadn't it? "Why are you here?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with fear. "What is this place? What happened to you?" The figure of his mother reached out, her hand moving unnaturally slow, as if time itself was stretching around her. She gestured to the chamber they were in, her movements deliberate and haunting. "This is the place where everything began," she whispered, her voice almost drowned by the eerie silence. "This temple, the one buried beneath the manor, it was always here, always waiting for you." Marcus took an unsteady step backward, his mind racing. The temple beneath the manor? He had never heard of anything like this. Had his parents known? Was this place the source of the darkness that had haunted his family? The ghostly figure of his mother's face twisted into a grimace, as if she were in pain. The fire was not an accident, Marcus. It was the beginning of something far worse, something tied to your bloodline, something ancient. Her form flickered for a moment, a ripple of distortion passing through her. Marcus's stomach churned as he realized that this wasn't just an apparition. This was her, but something else had claimed her, twisted her into this unnatural, hollow version of herself. The fire, she continued, her voice growing more frantic, was meant to destroy the truth, but you were spared. You were always meant to be the one to uncover it. Marcus's mind reeled. His parents' deaths, had they been sacrifices, or had they been protecting him from something far worse? What truth, he managed to choke out. What's happening? What's going to happen to me? She took a step closer, her hand reaching toward his chest, and as she did, Marcus felt a coldness seep into his very soul. A wave of darkness seemed to radiate from her, suffocating him. The truth is buried in your blood, Marcus. It was always within you, she whispered, her voice now an unbearable, shrill echo that rattled his bones. You are not like others. You are the key to the curse that binds this place, the curse that will soon consume you. A low rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The very air seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and Marcus felt his chest tighten as if something were pulling at his very life force. The figure of his mother's face warped further, her expression now contorted with pure malevolence. You have no choice now, Marcus. You are already part of the darkness. You always have been. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open, and Marcus stumbled forward, barely catching himself. The cavern was splitting apart, the stone walls groaning and shifting, as if the very temple were alive and responding to his presence. A terrible screech echoed through the air, and Marcus turned just in time to see shadows rising from the cracks in the floor. The shapes formed into twisted, shadowy figures, dark, hulking creatures with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through him. They surrounded him, their forms writhing like smoke, hungry for his very soul. His heart raced in terror. The shadows closed in, their chilling whispers promising only suffering. He was trapped. But then, he heard the voice again, this time not from his mother, but from the depths of the shadows themselves. The truth is always darkest when it is revealed. The shadows swirling and shifting around Marcus felt like a living nightmare. Their forms coiled in on themselves, pulsating with an unnatural energy, and the glowing eyes of the creatures flickered with malevolent hunger. He could hear their voices, low and growling, whispering fragmented sentences that made no sense, but still chilled him to the bone. You are the key. It is within you. The curse will consume you. His breath quickened, panic clawing at his chest. He stumbled backward, the shadows tightening their grip around him. He could feel them, like cold fingers, pulling at his mind, seeking to invade his thoughts. They knew his fear. They knew his every weakness. Why are you doing this? Marcus gasped, trying to shake the panic out of his voice. His eyes flicked between the shadows, his pulse racing. What do you want from me? From the depths of the shifting shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was not his mother this time, but something darker, an ancient being, its form twisted and made of darkness, with eyes glowing a sickly green. Its features were indistinct, like a person wrapped in a shroud of pure shadow, but its presence was enough to freeze Marcus in place. You have come too far to turn back, Marcus, the figure intoned, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate from the depths of the earth itself. You have awakened the bloodline's curse. The words echoed in Marcus's mind, sending a fresh wave of terror surging through him. The curse? What was this creature talking about? You are bound to this place, the creature continued, its voice seeping into the very air around them. Bound to the truth that lies in your blood. The fire was not to end your family, it was to protect you, to keep you from what would awaken when the time came. But the time has come, Marcus. The shadows surrounding him seemed to press closer, their weight unbearable. He could feel the pressure building, the cold seep into his very bones. No, "This can't be real," Marcus whispered, trying to find strength in his own voice, but it trembled with the enormity of the revelation. I'm not like this. I'm not part of whatever curse you're talking about." But deep down, he knew. A terrible gnawing feeling had been growing inside him since he first stepped into the manor, since the letter had called him here. The truth was coming into focus now, but it was far darker than anything he had imagined. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and a terrible, unnatural sound filled the air, like the scraping of stone on stone. "You are the last," the figure hissed. "The last of the bloodline, the one who will unlock the gate, and with your awakening, the darkness will spread once more." As the figure spoke, the ground beneath Marcus began to tremble. The cavern shook, the walls shifting as if the temple itself were alive, reacting to the presence of the bloodline's air. The shadows twisted around him like a living entity, wrapping around his body, pulling him toward the center of the room, toward the stone altar. His mind raced, but there was no escape. The altar loomed before him, its surface etched with strange symbols, some of which matched those in the journal. The key in his hand had begun to pulse with an intense heat, its energy growing stronger by the second. He tried to break free, but the shadows tightened their grip, dragging him forward. His limbs felt heavy, as if something was draining him, pulling the life out of him. "No," he whispered, struggling against the darkness. "I won't let this happen." But the shadows had already begun to envelop him completely. He felt himself sinking, falling into the very heart of the curse. The stone altar was right in front of him now, and his hand moved almost instinctively, placing the key into a hidden slot carved into the stone. A deafening screech filled the air as the key locked into place. The ground beneath him split open, and the cavern trembled violently, the shadows writhing around him as if in pain. Marcus felt a pull, a force stronger than anything he had ever experienced, sucking him into the very core of the earth. The altar seemed to crack open, revealing a blinding light that seared his vision. It was as if the world itself was unraveling before his eyes. And then, a voice. "It is time." Suddenly, everything stopped. The shadows disappeared. The noise, the pressure, the feeling of being consumed, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but a cold, empty silence. Marcus opened his eyes, blinking against the blinding light. He was no longer in the cavern. The world had shifted, and he found himself standing in a place he didn't recognize, a place between reality and something darker. The truth had been revealed. But what now? The silence was unbearable. Marcus stood at the edge of what felt like an endless void, his senses disoriented, struggling to grasp the reality of what had just transpired. He was no longer in the temple, no longer in the cavern or the manor. He was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond what he had known. The air was thick, the ground beneath his feet solid but cold, and the very atmosphere seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. The blinding light that had once surrounded him had faded, but a faint glow lingered, casting long, distorted shadows on the barren landscape before him. The world was a twisted reflection of the one he knew, a place where nothing made sense, where the laws of nature and time seemed to have no power. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He was still clutching the key, its once heatless surface now radiating a soft, unsettling warmth. It was the only thing anchoring him in this strange, distorted reality. But even that felt wrong. The key's presence seemed to pulse with an energy that resonated with something deep inside him, something he couldn't yet comprehend. A distant, eerie sound reached his ears, a whisper, faint but growing louder, until it became a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. "You have opened the Yush gate. You have crossed the threshold. Now you must face what lies within." The words echoed around him, seeming to come from every direction, yet no one was in sight. The voices were cold and hollow, as if they were emanating from the very air itself. Marcus took a tentative step forward, his mind racing. Face what lies within. What did that mean? He had already uncovered more than he had ever wanted to know. His parents' deaths, the curse, the darkness that had followed him. None of it made sense, and yet it was all connected. But he still didn't know the why behind it all. He needed answers, and this was the only place left to find them. The ground beneath his feet shifted, and the soft hum of the air turned into a low rumbling, like the sound of something immense stirring beneath the surface. The landscape began to distort, warping into impossible shapes. Trees twisted into unnatural spirals, the sky darkened and cracked like a broken mirror. And then before him, a figure emerged from the shifting fog, a tall, hooded silhouette that seemed to blend with the shadows around it. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate, and as it did, the air around it seemed to shimmer with an ethereal light. Marcus felt his heart race. Another figure? Was this another manifestation of the curse? Or something else entirely? The figure raised its hand, its voice a soft, chilling whisper. "You have awakened the Ancient One, Marcus. The Bloodline's legacy cannot be undone, and now you will see the truth as it truly is." The figure's words were like a dagger to his mind, sharp and unrelenting. Marcus could feel his breath catch in his throat, his chest tightening with an overwhelming sense of dread. The key in his hand began to burn, its warmth seeping into his skin, spreading through his body like fire. "The truth?" Marcus managed to say, his voice raw with fear. "What truth? What do you want from me?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The voices in the air grew louder, their whispers becoming incoherent, filling Marcus's mind with fragmented images, memories that were not his own. He saw flashes of the manor again, but this time it was not as he remembered it. The house was alive with shadows, twisted figures lurking in the corners, whispering in languages that sent his mind spinning. He saw his parents, not as they were before the fire, but as they had been in another time. Ancient, their faces drawn with sorrow and fear. He saw his mother, her eyes pleading for him to run, to leave it all behind. The images blurred, shifting violently, until Marcus was no longer sure if he was seeing memories or visions of something else entirely. Something far older. Something tied to the curse that had been passed down through his bloodline. Finally, the figure spoke again, its voice cold and final. "You are the vessel, Marcus. You are the one who will carry the curse into the world, and the truth will consume you, just as it consumed them." Before he could react, the world around him seemed to fracture, the ground breaking apart, the sky above splintering like glass. A dark, swirling mass appeared before him, a black vortex that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air hummed with a terrible power, and Marcus felt himself being pulled toward it, his body unable to resist the force. He was falling again, falling into the abyss. "There is no escape," the voice echoed in his mind, a final warning. And then, everything went black.